Thanks, Ann. Thank you all for coming. Clearly, with the turnout today, and with everything that's going on in the Fox Valley, this is one of the key locations for changing public discourse. We're going to talk about this thing called biconceptualism, which means that you are part conservative and part progressive, and clearly that's the case in the Fox Valley, as it is all over the state. What I really want to do tonight is give you some practical experience with how to, as we say, pivot or shift the frame. Okay? So when you meet people who think more conservatively, that you know how to talk to them, how to evoke progressive ideas. But first, I want, and some of you who are really in tune with what George Lakoff has done and others in cognitive science, some of you have been to the trainings. Some of this is going to be old hat, but it never hurts to have it reinforced. Over the last 20 years, there have been some great discoveries in the fields of cognitive and neuroscience that tell us a lot about how our brains work. And this is really important when you start talking about, really important things like public policy and where there are divides in intellectuals. So there's some key points that are going to be addressed today, and I'll just go through real quickly. First, policies are based on morals. Okay? All politics is moral. Okay? Progressives like to think that conservatives are mean, that they're stupid, and that they don't care about morality. That's wrong. Conservatives believe they are moral. Now, whether you think they're moral or not is not relevant. They believe they are moral. Okay, no politician says, I support this law, or I want you to support this law because I said so, or because it's wrong, or it's evil. They say, vote for me and support my policies because they are right. Okay. Next. We have a false reliance on rationality. Okay? All of us in this room were trained with the 18th century view of thought, and that is, all thought is rational. You can reason directly about the world. All language is neutral. And this is basically what René Descartes said. I think, therefore I am. Wrong. 100% wrong. All thought relies on emotion. You cannot think without processing emotion. So men, if you ever accuse a woman of being emotional, guess what? You're just as emotional as they are. You cannot think. There's an Italian cognitive scientist who did research on stroke patients who lost the ability to feel emotion because of a stroke. Guess what? They couldn't make any decisions. They did not know what to think about the world. They could not reason about the world without emotion. Your dominant frame, we're going to learn what a frame is in a minute here, determines your core values. Okay? If you are dominantly progressive, that determines your core moral values. If you are conservatively dominated, that determines your core moral values. So when you relate that to the idea that thought relies on emotion, and where your core values come from, that's critically important. Okay? What we want to do today is activate your progressive frame and teach you how to activate other people's progressive frames. Why? Because when you activate one, you inhibit the other. It's called mutual inhibition, and your brain does it all the time. You don't even think about it. You take a drink of water, you can't breathe through your nose. Your brain doesn't let you. Okay? You cannot think in the conservative frame and the progressive frame at the same time. Your brain doesn't allow you to do that. You'll see why in a minute. Communicating the progressive frame through your values over and over and over and over again, hundreds and hundreds of times with thousands and thousands of people doing it, will change common sense. How do we know this? Because that's what the conservatives have done for 40 years. It's the same thing. And this is not focused on a single election. Okay? This is a process for long-term change. And to do that, we have to be consistent and repetitive. So, what are frames? Very simply, framing is thinking. You frame all the time. You can't help it. Right? If I say scalpel, what do you think of? Hospital, surgeon. It activates an entire set of images in your mind, right? If I say chef, what do you think? Restaurant, right? That's a frame. There's a hospital frame. You have unconscious built-in expectations for what happens in the hospital frame, right? If you walk into the hospital and the nurse hands you a scalpel and says, you're going to be performing on the surgeon today, you know something, the frame's broken. You know something's wrong. Unconsciously. You don't even have to think about it. Okay? Now, this is really important. Okay? Framing is thinking, and that thought is physical. Ideas aren't just out there in the air, jumping into your head. Okay? It happens physically. You think with your brain. You have no choice. Okay? Your brain evolved to run a body, and because of that, frames are the neural circuits in your brain. Okay? Everything that you've experienced in your life develops neural circuitry, which leads to frames. Okay? Most of your dominant frame is developed when you're very, very young. That's really critically important. So when we talk about framing an issue, we're not just talking about putting it in a box. Okay? We're talking about evoking a physical neural circuit that exists in people's brains. Okay? And what that does is it activates the neural circuit for the frame. Okay? I know it gets a little wonkish, but if you imagine a neural circuit as a path through the woods, okay? There's two paths. The one that you take most often is going to be the one that's the most accessible, it's the most worn, it's the one you know better, and it's the one you take most frequently, and that is how neural circuitry develops in your brain. And I will tell you, for most of us, that path through the woods is the conservative path in terms of language and what is unconsciously activated in your brain. We have to start exercising the other path. So, as I said, framing is thinking. Okay? Descartes was wrong. Okay? Thought is not rational. It requires emotion. Frame use, and all thought for that matter, because framing is thinking, is mostly unconscious. If I were to ask you, and those of you who know this already don't have, how much of your thought you think is conscious? Come up with a percentage in your mind of how much you think you control your thought. Unconscious thought accounts for 98% of your brain activity. You only control 2 to 3% of your brain function. It has to be that way. Right? Your brain evolved to run a body. You could not possibly function without your brain controlling 98% of it being unconscious. Okay? Brains run in parallel circuitry. Okay? You can't think fast enough to keep up with that. Your brain is literally, it's not a computer. Okay? It's a biological function. This is really important as well. As progressives, we repeat and reinforce conservative messaging all the time. We don't even think about it. Why? We'll see in a second. Conservative language, conservative messaging has dominated common sense. It's deeply, deeply embedded in our culture. One of the ways we do that is something called negation. Okay? Richard Nixon said, "I'm not a crook." Right? Everybody thought he was a crook. Lakoff has this thing where he walks into a graduate seminar and he says, "Don't think of an elephant. What do? Not only do you think of an elephant, you each have different visuals, different metaphors associated with elephants. It's very powerful. So, just to drop a hint for what's coming later, if I say, Scott Walker broke his promise on job creation, what am I doing?
99% true.
No, I'm negating. I'm saying Scott Walker and I'm saying job creation. Okay, regardless of the facts, you've just activated the entire conservative frame, and we'll get to how that happens, but the entire conservative frame is activated by evoking that phrase. Frames are tremendously powerful. Look at those two images. Debt ceiling. School vouchers. Okay, those are all in the conservative frame. They're tremendously powerful. Okay, they evoke certain images in your mind. You have certain metaphors related to them. And you don't even think about it. This happens unconsciously in a split second. Okay? How is it critical? Every message has a frame. Okay? Why do progressives have such a hard time coming up with bumper sticker slogans? Right? Bumper stickers are what's called surface frames. Right? They have to evoke something more deeply embedded in the culture. Right? So when you see a Scott Walker bumper sticker that says "Believe in Wisconsin," it doesn't even have to say Scott Walker, does it? You know what it means. Why? Because that frame is so deeply embedded in what we consider common sense, in what is in our culture. Okay, progressives don't have anything like that, or very little. Okay, we have to start changing that public discourse so that those bumper sticker slogans come out of things that we understand. Okay, again, a frame defines your moral worldview, and in Wisconsin and American politics, there's two, conservative and progressive. People vote and respond to morals and values. People don't vote facts. Okay? Obviously, more people vote on moral frames and issues. Why do people continually vote against their own self-interests? They're voting moral frames. They're voting values. Family values. Personal liberty. Small government. Those are moral frames. So, because frames are based on these core values, right? Things you deeply, deeply hold, within your moral certitude, right? The most commonly used frame defines what common sense is. And because conservatives have dominated framing, they have redefined common sense. Okay, I'll give you some examples. Okay? Destroying public education is called what? School choice. Right? Earned benefits are now thought of as pensions or entitlements. Right? Okay? Negotiating for a fair portion of profit is now called collective bargaining. Okay? Conservatives have intentionally dominated this process. Okay? Because of it, we have to start taking it back. And again, activation of one frame inhibits activation of the opposing frame. Okay? This is why Fox News is so powerful. When you have a mediator, so-called, on Fox News conducting an interview of a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate, and the moderator turns to the Dem and says, "Are you for or against tax relief?" Guess what? Doesn't matter how that person answers the question. Right? Because in order for there to be relief from something, there has to be what? An unjust burden. Taxes have been framed as an unjust burden. So if you answer the question and respond in that frame, you reinforce the frame. Even if you say, and honestly, to the candidates, what candidate is going to say in this day and age, "I'm against tax relief"? You can't say that. We'll get to what you can say in a little bit. So, frames define your moral worldview. 2 frames. Progressive frame and the conservative frame. Now, how were these discovered? Okay? It's because the nation fits the metaphor of a family. Okay, when were you first governed? As a child, right? By your parents. Okay? So, the nation as a family metaphor fits everything. Okay, the core of the progressive frame is the idea of a nurturing parent family. Okay, both parents have equal responsibility to raise their children, to provide them with opportunity, to provide them with the freedom to grow into responsible adults, and we'll get to more of that later. The conservative frame, on the other hand, is based on the strict father-family metaphor. And this is not gender neutral. Okay, in the conservative frame, he is literally a strict father, male figure. And we'll get to more of why that's the case later. But think James Dobson, Dare to Discipline. That's the strict father family. Okay? So, how do you identify with the progressive idea of democracy, this nurturing parent idea? Okay. Everything I'm going to tell you, these are all things that you know. You probably understand these instinctively, you just don't communicate them. Okay, so what I'm here to tell you today is you need to start communicating them. You need to start talking about these things. When you start talking about issues, you need to start communicating these ideals, these values. Okay? First, the core value in the progressive frame is empathy. Okay, you heard Barack Obama did this brilliantly early on in his term, his first term. He gave a great Father's Day speech in Chicago at a Southside church where he talked about how the fathers in the African American community need to step up and start acting on their empathy for their children, for their partners, for the community. Okay? When a reporter asked Barack Obama what the most important thing that his mother taught him, the first thing he said was empathy. Okay, the press screwed it up and said sympathy, and conservatives jumped off, and he backed off it, unfortunately. But empathy. And empathy means that you care for others as you care for yourself. Right? You have to take care of yourself, but you also have to have that same amount of empathy and care for others. Kind of your brother's keeper thing. Okay. Authority in the progressive frame is gained through an ethic of excellence. Okay, you live by what you say. As progressives, we believe that our elected leaders are the ones who are excellent. We elect them to lead us because we believe that they live by what we believe, and they will represent that. Okay? And that's what we want to teach our kids as progressives, this idea of the nurturing parent. What is democracy in the progressive frame? We need to say this over and over again. It's caring citizens acting responsibly for each other. Okay. If you are a caring citizen acting responsibly for someone else, do you support sand mining?
No.
Okay. The idea of freedom is what we call a contested value. Right? You hear conservatives say freedom, you hear progressives talk about freedom. It's a contested value, which progressives need to work at reclaiming. Right? The idea of progressive freedom means that we act through government, which is all of us, to provide public resources to maximize freedom. It's that simple. Libraries, roads, the internet, court system, public education, buses, sewers, right? Try to run a business without the public. Can't do it. Again, private life and enterprise is not possible without the public. Okay? We need to say this over and over and over again. Private life and enterprise is not possible without the public. Okay, I would love to challenge Senator Grothman to tell me how you can be prosperous as a person without the public. You can't do it. Therefore, freedom is not possible without the public. Okay, this nation was founded on that principle. Now, it's important to be able to identify the conservative idea of democracy. And I'm hoping that as we go through these, you're going to think, oh yeah, I hear that all the time. I hear Paul Ryan say that, or evoke that, or Ron Johnson, or Scott Walker, or CNN, or ABC, because it's all over the news. Okay? The authority figure defines right and wrong. Period. And it's the Father. Okay? And rules through punishment. And that punishment should be physical, and it should be painful. Okay, again, think of James Dobson, Dare to Discipline.
Who is James Dobson?
Oh, James Dobson is a conservative, far right-wing religious leader.
Okay.
His focus on the family.
Sorry, I didn't know.
Oh, that's okay. He wrote a book, Dare to Discipline, which basically tells how to raise children in the conservative, strict father frame. And he talks about spanking children when they're 13 months old. Right? But why, more importantly, why is it the case? Because in the conservative moral frame, right, children are born evil. Children are born bad. They're born undisciplined. Okay, to be successful in the world, they need to be taught discipline. This is what the conservative moral frame says. This is probably starting to ring a bell.
How come they're not putting any of the bankers in jail then?
We're going to get to that. That's a great, did you hear, why aren't bankers going to jail, right?
They should be punished.
In the conservative frame, there's a hierarchy. Okay, there's always a hierarchy. Right? You see it in religion, you see it in culture, right? It's God over man. Man over woman. Okay? Whites over non-whites. Christians over non-Christians. The United States over all other countries. Right? You see this all the time. There has to be a hierarchy. Okay? Self-discipline is required to make one moral. Think about that in terms of economics. If you are unemployed and poor, why do conservatives rationalize that fact? It is because you are undisciplined. Therefore, you are immoral. Therefore, you deserve your poverty. When you become more disciplined through the pain of being unemployed and poor, you will then become moral and therefore successful. You have a responsibility for yourself alone first, irregardless of others. And democracy in the conservative, and this should sound very familiar to you in the current day and age, it provides maximum liberty to seek one's own self-interest. Think of every conservative economic policy that exists today. That's the answer. Now, why don't bankers go to jail? In the conservative frame, to be successful, you must be what? No, disciplined, and therefore moral. Therefore, those who are wealthy are inherently what? Moral. So, success comes from self-discipline. Lack of success implies lack of morality. The public, the government, is immoral. Right? Why does Karl Rove want to shrink government down to the size of a baby so he can drown in the bathtub? Because it's immoral. It takes away the incentive for personal and private success. Does this sound familiar? This is really important because this is what gives us hope in changing public discourse. Okay, the fact, there's a fundamental truth that the private depends on the public. Conservatives hide that fact. They hide that truth. Okay, why do they hide it? Because in order for them to maintain their moral frame, that has to be so. So that gives us an opportunity to talk about the public and why it's important. So, quick review. Critical concepts that come out of this whole cognitive science thing. Facts don't win votes. Nobody cares how many tons of sand are taken out of Chippewa County. To conservatives, it doesn't matter. Why? It's about job creation. Right? Conservatives don't care that Scott Walker didn't create 250,000 jobs. Facts don't matter. He's moral. You laugh, they believe that. And if you don't believe that, you are vastly underestimating your opponent. I'm going to give you a little insight. The message, Scott Walker failed, is a disaster. No offense to anybody in the Democratic Party, but from what we're talking about today, Scott Walker failed is a disaster. Why? First of all, you're saying Scott Walker over and over and over again. What's one of the most important things in politics? Name recognition. Plus the idea of negation. Even if you negate it, you're reinforcing it. Every time you say Scott Walker, look, Scott Walker, do any of us disagree that he embodies the conservative frame? The conservative moral frame? No. Every time you say Scott Walker, you're reinforcing and activating that conservative frame. And failed? Is failure bad? Has anybody in this room not failed? Something very moral and very just and still fail. So by saying Scott Walker failed, unconsciously, first of all, you're acknowledging the fact that he is a moral actor. He's tried to do something. Right? He says it all the time. You know, we're making the hard decisions. We'll get to how to undermine Walker later. So, the fact is that truth needs a frame to be accepted. Facts are important, but only in as far as you can frame them. Right? Talk about how, and I've got sand mine in the brain because I've been talking about, talk about how sand mining steals property values. Talk about, how it destroys the land. Talk about how it jeopardizes our children. And then tell people the facts. Okay? You have to frame the facts first. Oops. There's no such thing as a moderate. There's no such thing as a centrist. There's no center. There's no ideology or moral frame of the center. Okay? People are biconceptual. What's biconceptual? Easy. Part conservative, part progressive. Okay? Why did 40% of private sector union members vote for Scott Walker? Biconceptual. In their personal life, they are probably they were raised or live as a strict father. They identified very strongly with that frame, therefore, Scott Walker appealed to them. Polls are fatally flawed, as they are conducted now. Why? Polls are based, and I'm not going to get into this too much. Candidates, if you want to talk about this more later, I can tell you more later. But polls are based on a statistical model. Okay? The statistical model used in polls will always display what's called the mean. Okay? The mean is the average, right? All polling is telling you and showing is what's called the regression to the mean. You may have a range of opinions on both sides that go like this. All that poll is going to show you is the regression to the mean of that entire sample in the distribution. It's a statistical fact. You can look it up. And I can show you my blog where it is. Right? The fact is, this is how.
The top of the bell curve?
Exactly. That's how a standard poll will always display the mean. Right? Here's conservative, here's progressive, here's the range or the range of answers, and this is the distribution of responses. At Cal Berkeley, they're doing work with the Cognitive Computing Center, and they're coming up with new ways to poll. Okay? When you include the values and moral responses of people, and you show the full distribution, the center drops out, and you get this. You get a bimodal distribution. Right? Now here's progressive, here's conservative, the middle drops out. Those points show you where biconceptuals are on an issue. Yet we follow this. People get paid lots of money to do it. So, the other thing about poll, yep.
Yeah, I just need to make a quick comment.
Sure.
We're using the terms progressive and conservative, and I think that progressive is an accurate description, probably of most of the people in this room, all the people in this room. We're using the word conservative to describe a behavior and an ideology in the far right today that is anything but conservative. And I think it's another example of where we have allowed the other side to steal the language and to define themselves as something that they are not. And it gives legitimacy to their arguments, and it gives legitimacy to their behaviors. When they oppose quality education, they oppose progressive action on the climate change issue, on infrastructure issues. Just hold on. And they package that as the conservative position. It's not a conservative position. A conservative position would say the cost benefit of rebuilding infrastructure is there. The same thing with education. If we don't correct the deteriorating climate now, no generation will be able to do it in the future. My only point is that we're calling them conservative. They're not conservative.
They're extremists.
Okay, you're talking about what would have been considered conservative 20 or 30 years ago.
No, that's part of it.
No, my point is this. My point is this. That we're talking about the difference between two core moral centers. Okay? So when we talk about the conservative frame here, we're talking about not a position on an issue. You're confusing the position on an issue with the moral foundation of where that decision comes from. So in today's conservative world, they base their position on an issue on the values we just went over.
We're allowing them to call themselves something in the public and in the rhetoric that they are not.
I would go further than that. We're allowing them to dominate the framing of every issue in that ideology.
And we need to be saying to them, your position does not reflect conservatism. We don't know what it reflects, but it is not a conservative position.
Well, I would disagree that that's what you need to say. I think
we need to understand it.
Yes, you need to understand it.
Understand
but I would not recommend saying that. You had a question back there also.
I was just going to quickly ask, talking about when you're saying that polls are basically useless. It's interesting though, in Romney, Obama, the Obama team seemed to be pretty spot on where they thought the votes would end up, and the Romney team, they were sure they were going to win.
Oh, okay.
I'm just talking.
That's, yeah, polling to say who's going to win an election is a lot different than issue polling.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yep.
Before Lewis Powell became Justice Lewis Powell, it took him this, say, less than, go back 10 years ago, from when he was a judge till about 10, 15 years ago, to change this to a moral, this is the moral way to think. And it was his memorandums to all these corporations that pushed that concept in the Lewis Powell memorandum.
That started the money flow. This actually, this conservative populism dominance, this actually started during the Nixon campaign in it would have been 68, 9, when they coined the term liberal elite. Right, what was happening in the 60s? Civil rights movement, Vietnam war protests, and the progressives were dominating public discourse. Right? The conservatives needed a challenge to that, and it was actually one of Nixon's speechwriters, Buchanan, that came up with it, liberal elite. Right? And it started this whole idea of the liberal academics are undisciplined, they're immoral, they're anti-country. So it started a long time ago, and they knew exactly what they were doing.
I think that his point was that even Nixon supported family planning.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the numbers made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas
she was saying that even Nixon supported family planning because the numbers made sense, right? And see, the whole point to this is that we've gotten out of balance. Right? Where you have healthy public discourse, you hear both of these frames in public discourse. And we used to hear both frames in public discourse. So there used to be a balance. So, right, Nixon was a bisexual. Tommy Thompson was a bisexual. Right? There were some things that he did that today conservatives would go, we'd never do that today. Right? So we're talking about, yes, extremism. We're talking about the evolution of extremism and how the fact that it's dominating discourse is having such a harmful effect. I'm going to move on over.
Yeah, just a quickie, a suggestion. I don't care if we call them conservatives in this room. That's just a label for a bunch of people, but we all know what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I would never get in an argument with a conservative about what conservatism is. But when I'm talking to biconceptuals, I always try to avoid the word conservative, because I think that does have some very positive ramifications, even to me.
Mm-hmm.
And who was saying? I call them right-wing extremists. Paul Ryan is a right-wing extremist, and that's the only label I use when I'm talking to biconceptuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Yes. Again, this kind of goes over. There's a difference between moral and partisan. Okay, we're not talking Democrat, we're not talking Republican. Okay, I know some Republicans that are very nice people, that are really good people, that really think they're doing the right thing. And morally, we disagree. But we have to start talking in terms of moral versus partisan. I think that's really important. So, what we're going to talk about today is, what's the key to changing minds? First, identify the moral frame. Right? Identify where they're coming from. Second, think about where there's biconceptualism on an issue. Look, a lot of conservatives love their public schools. Why? They're the heart of the community. Right? That's the community that lives in those public schools. There's a lot of conservatives that love their public schools. Ask Luther Olson.
Yeah.
So find where the biconceptualism is and then talk to them. You know, people, I have friends that go, I can't talk to my family at Christmas time. Right? My uncle, he's a right-wing nut job. I can't talk to him. We get in a fight. I'm like, well, ask him what he does for people that he's proud of. Right? Everybody should have something. Unless you're a sociopath. There should be something you do for other people that you are proud of, that you enjoy. Talk to him about that. Open him up. See, that's where you get people to start activating that empathy. That's what we need to do. And as you're going to see later, okay, when we start talking about the frame and the message that you should be talking about, right, the same message works on every issue. And that's important. Because when we only talk about issues, we create silos. Right? Even in the environmental community. Right? There's the lake people, there's the stream people, there's the trout people, there's the pheasant people, there's the land protection people, right? And they all talk about their issue relative to their specific subset of natural resources in the environment. Okay, but if you talk about it in terms of values and freedom and opportunity and, you know, private prosperity not possible to the public, right? Now you connect with everything. You connect with education. You connect education with environment. You connect, you know, labor rights with women's health. Because it's all about the same thing. And conservatives are great at that. Right? Chris Taylor comes back from an ALEC conference and she said, you know, every single seminar was about personal liberty and small government. Those are values, right? And that relates to every single issue that the conservatives talk about. We got to do the same thing. As I just said, when you speak to values, you avoid the issue silos. So we've had some questions. So now before we move on to kind of the meat and potatoes here of really diving into some issues and breaking them apart and challenging you to come up with messages and values to describe and talk differently about issues. Any other questions on any of that stuff?
You say never mention your opponent's name, but probably one of the most successful commercials ever on television were the ones that specifically mentioned Dukakis.
That's part of it was that Dukakis kind of made his own bed in that case. So there are cases where that, but see, I would say Walker, you know, or my opponent, something like that, respectfully, my opponent, you know, or just a last name. I mean, the problem is that Michael Dukakis didn't really embody the progressive frame in that point in time. You know, right now the problem is that Scott Walker is the embodiment of the conservative frame. You know, just his image evokes the entire frame. So part of the strategy has to be just use his last name, my opponent. You know, I wouldn't even say the government, because honestly, because that reinforces the position he's in. You know, so it's not easy. It's a hard one, yeah.
Yeah, the same message in the progressive frame works on every issue. You encapsulated the conservatives as personal liberty and small government. How would you encapsulate the progressive frame?
Oh, freedom, responsibility, opportunity, community. You'll get to practice some of that later too. And honestly, I mean, look, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But here's the problem, is that, right, the things that you like mostly, that are held most deeply within your unconscious is your moral certitude. Right? You don't think about the way you act, you just do it. Okay, it's because it's so deeply embedded in you. What we're trying to do is to make that unconscious thought conscious a little bit. So you start activating that within yourself and within others. And that's what this is all about. And this is up to you to come up with, because every community around the state is different. Milwaukee is not the same as Appleton, not the same as Madison, is not the same as Green Bay or Superior or Wausau. Each community has different subcurrents of issues and values going on. You know, some people that are biconceptual on something here may not be biconceptual on that issue in another area of the state. You know, people in Robin Voss's district might not be so biconceptual on education.
But you were saying conservative or conservatives as personal liberty and small government. So you're saying and that's national overall. I'm not trying to jive that with what you just said about things being different among different.
Oh, meaning what kind of messages work, right? The values are all the same. These overarching values are the same. It's what we're going to talk about here, what you would say about an issue, how you would specifically message it in your, in your campaign or your campaign is going to depend on your constituents. Because honestly, it's, when Melissa Sargent goes and talks to her constituents in Madison, there's going to be different things that resonate with them as in your district.
Very different.
Yeah, very different.
Very different.
Right, but you have to find ways to relate those values verbally and in writing to people that are meaningful to them.
Isn't part of the problem is that they have taken what used to be a good thing and turned it into a morally bad thing? For example, birth control pills. It was a sun rising in the 60s, but now it's shameful.
We have a slide on that.
Yeah.
And to you, it's morally reprehensible what the conservatives are saying about women's health, right?
Well, what I'm saying is they have changed the total outlook of people.
Exactly, that's right. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to change common sense and how the public thinks about women's health. So, and hopefully some of you get this joke or this little clip here or segment. You know how to get to Carnegie Hall practice. So we're going to try and get you all to Carnegie Hall in this whole framing and messaging. So I have 6 examples here. Whether we have time to get to them all, we'll see.